In the shifting sands of North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed he had found the fatal flaw of the American spirit during the disastrous retreat at Kasserine Pass. As Major General Lloyd Fredendall's command collapsed into chaos, the humiliated army faced total annihilation. However, the arrival of George S. Patton Jr. on March 6, 1943, would ignite a transformation so radical it shattered every German assumption of superiority. The desert wind of mid-February 1943 carried the scent of cordite and the bitter taste of defeat across the Tunisian border, as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat in the dim light of his command post, drafting a letter to his wife Lucy. He wrote with the cold precision of a predator who had just tasted blood, having witnessed his veteran forces smash through the American positions at Kasserine Pass with a brutality that left the newly arrived Westerners reeling in shock. Outside the tent, the men of the Africa Corps were celebrating a victory they believed signaled the end of American involvement in the theater. But inside, Rommel was meticulously analyzing the data he had gathered about this new opponent. His assessment was devastatingly blunt, recording for history his belief that the Americans were soft, fundamentally lacked proper military training, and were led by officers who made amateur mistakes that would have resulted in immediate court-martials in any professional European army. Rommel had watched with his own eyes as American forces broke and ran under the weight of the German onslaught, leaving over 6,000 casualties in just 6 days of fighting. It was a collapse of monumental proportions, where entire battalions surrendered in mass and high-quality equipment was abandoned on the battlefield in a panic reminiscent of the French defeat in 1940. The Americans did not just suffer a tactical loss at Kasserine, they were utterly humiliated, and soldiers who had grown up on romanticized stories of World War I heroism were suddenly and violently forced to question if they were even cut out for the modern industrial warfare of the 20th century. Rommel did not merely see a tactical opening to exploit. He genuinely believed he was witnessing the American national spirit breaking in real time under the pressure of German steel. He wrote to Lucy that if Germany could launch another concentrated offensive within a matter of weeks, they could push the disorganized Americans back into the sea before they ever had the chance to learn how to fight properly. This assessment was immediately shared with Berlin, urging the High Command to exploit American weakness without delay and never give the Green Forces time to adapt to the reality of the front lines. It is crucial to understand that Rommel's assessment was not born of simple prejudice, but was based on the observed performance of the Second Corps during their first major engagement. At Kasserine Pass, the American forces had demonstrated multiple critical failures, ranging from commanders positioning their units in indefensible terrain to a total collapse of radio discipline under the slightest pressure. There was a complete lack of coordination between the infantry and the armor, and when the German forces attacked, American units frequently retreated without waiting for orders, which created a cascading effect of panic throughout the entire line. The rot started at the very top with the American Second Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, who had infamously built his headquarters in a deep canyon 70 miles behind the front lines. From this subterranean sanctuary, Fredendall attempted to direct a complex battle via radio and telephone without ever setting foot on the actual battlefield, leading to orders that were consistently confused and contradictory. German intelligence officers, having compiled detailed reports on the engagement, noted that while American equipment was adequate and the individual soldiers fought bravely when cornered, the command structure was purely amateur. These were not soldiers who had faced the veteran Wehrmacht before, and they were trying to learn the brutal art of modern warfare in real time against Germany's most experienced commanders. Rommel calculated with surgical precision that it would take the Americans at least 6 months to even begin fixing their leadership problems, and probably a full 12 months to develop any kind of effective combat doctrine. He was convinced that if Germany struck again in March, the results would be a mirror image of the Kasserine disaster. German armored doctrine had proven itself against every opponent since 1939, relying on the concentration of superior force at a single weak point to achieve a breakthrough. Once the armored spearheads broke the line, they would exploit the gap with mobile formations, forcing the enemy to either retreat in disorder or face total encirclement. This was the same formula that had shattered the French armies in 6 weeks, destroyed Soviet armies in 1941, and pushed the British across North Africa twice. The formula worked because most armies fought defensively, trying to hold static lines that German mobility could easily bypass and isolate. Kasserine Pass had proven to the German High Command that the Americans fought the same way, establishing defensive positions and simply waiting to be attacked, When German armor concentrated against weak sectors, the Americans chose to retreat rather than launch the necessary counterattacks to restore their lines. Rommel began studying the terrain around El Guettar in central Tunisia, identifying it as the perfect stage for another demonstration of German tactical superiority. He believed that an attack in late March would catch American units while they were still physically and psychologically recovering from the trauma of Kasserine. The psychological advantage alone would be decisive, and Berlin approved Rommel's assessment, believing one more offensive would break American morale completely. The ultimate goal was to force the Americans to ship their defeated army home so Germany could shift its full weight to face the British. However, the German intelligence reports missed a seismic shift that occurred in early March when Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. assumed command of the Second Corps on March 6, 1943. When Patton arrived at the headquarters that had once belonged to the disgraced Fredendall, the atmosphere changed before he even uttered his first command. He rolled into the camp with a siren-blaring motorcade, wearing his famous ivory-handled revolvers as a visible symbol of a new, uncompromising era of American leadership. Patton did not just issue orders. He issued an ultimatum to every man under his command, declaring that the days of the soft American soldier were officially over. He forced men to wear ties and regulation helmets, even in the suffocating desert heat, not out of vanity, but to remind them that they were professionals and not defeated refugees. Officers who arrived without the proper uniform were fined on the spot, and soldiers who failed to salute were publicly reprimanded to instill a sense of pride and discipline. The German assessment remained skeptical, believing that one general could not possibly fix systemic problems in just 3 weeks. They conceded that Patton might improve morale slightly and enforce better discipline, but they were certain he could not teach an entire corps a new combat doctrine in less than a month. Rommel's own health was failing due to stomach ailments and exhaustion, yet his tactical mind remained as sharp as ever as he prepared his final moves. He reviewed the El Guettar attack plan one final time before turning operational command over to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, confident in his assumptions. The plan was built entirely on the assumption that the Americans would use the same hesitant defensive tactics they had used before. It assumed that 3 weeks was simply not enough time to transform a broken army into a fighting machine, a logic that was consistent with every German experience since the start of the war. By March 22, 1943, the German forces were prepared to launch their strike near El Guettar, led by the veteran 10th Panzer Division. German commanders briefed their units to expect the usual response. The Americans would defend from fixed positions and likely fail to coordinate their air and artillery support. They believed the superior firepower of the German 75mm guns would penetrate the Sherman armor at 2,000 yards, while the Americans would need to close to 500 yards to even stand a chance. The technical advantage in firepower was decisive in the open desert terrain, and German artillery prepared fire plans to suppress the American positions, just as they had done at Kasserine. As dawn broke over El Guettar on March 23rd, the German forces advanced with the full expectation of another easy victory, unaware that 3 weeks under Patton had been enough time to change everything that mattered. The German offensive at El Guettar began precisely at 6 o'clock in the morning on March 23, 1943, with the lead elements of the elite 10th Panzer Division rolling toward American positions held by the legendary 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One. Visibility across the desert floor was excellent, and the terrain favored the advancing German armor, seemingly matching every detail of the operational plan that had been meticulously crafted by the German High Command. Then, without warning, the desert floor erupted into a hellish landscape of fire and steel as American artillery opened fire with a level of coordination the Germans had never before witnessed from an Allied force. These were not the hesitant ranging shots or the scattered, disorganized fire of the Kasserine Pass disaster. Instead, these were massive, coordinated, time-on-target salvos that dropped the fire of multiple batteries onto German positions simultaneously. Every gun in the Second Corps had been trained to concentrate its fire on a single point at the exact same second, creating a mechanical symphony of violence that shattered the German columns before they could even deploy for battle. This level of sophisticated artillery coordination was something the German forces, who still relied heavily on horse-drawn artillery for their logistics, simply could not replicate or defend against. The sheer volume and accuracy of the American fire were shocking to the veteran German tank crews, who watched as their armored vehicles took direct hits from heavy, high-explosive shells. Radio operators inside the German tanks heard a constant stream of urgent, panic calls from their accompanying infantry units, who were being decimated by the barrage and were desperately requesting medical evacuation. The Germans realized immediately that the Americans were no longer suppressed by the threat of the Panzer. They were firing back with a precision that suggested the presence of highly professional forward observers and deeply experienced artillery crews. Despite the devastating fire, the 10th Panzer Division continued its advance, as their commanders believed this was merely the expected level of resistance and that the Americans would eventually break under sustained pressure. German officers ordered their units to push through the wall of artillery and close the distance with the American positions, expecting the infantry to flee as they had done just weeks earlier. Suddenly, American tank destroyers, which had been carefully positioned in concealed flanking locations, opened fire with lethal accuracy. The Germans discovered too late that the Americans were no longer defending from obvious, static positions. Instead, they had positioned their anti-tank weapons to create deadly crossfires that made the German armor vulnerable regardless of which direction they faced. By 9 o'clock in the morning, German forces had managed to penetrate 2,000 yards into the American lines, a distance that would normally signal the beginning of a breakthrough. However, the Americans were not retreating in panic. They were conducting disciplined fighting withdrawals to prepared secondary positions, making the Germans pay for every inch of sand they captured. For the men of the 1st Infantry Division, the battle at El Guettar was not just another engagement. It was a collective exorcism of the shame they had felt after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass. These were the same soldiers who had been mocked by Rommel as soft, yet as the 10th Panzer rolled toward them, they did not look for an exit or a way to surrender. They looked through their sights with a cold professional rage, having traded their fear for a lethal efficiency that stunned their German counterparts. German radio intercepts picked up American communications throughout the morning, but the tone of the chatter was unrecognizable compared to the chaos of February. The American officers were giving clear, calm tactical orders, and units were reporting their positions and coordinating their fields of fire with mechanical precision. This was not the panicked radio chatter of a defeated army, but the voice of a professional force that was executing a complex defensive plan with absolute confidence. American infantry units held their positions under heavy German fire until the exact moment they were ordered to withdraw, and even then, they moved to new positions to resume the fight immediately. They were executing tactical retreats that preserved their unit cohesion while making the German advance increasingly costly in terms of men and material. On the German right flank, the Italian Centauro Division reported that they were meeting heavy resistance and that American machine gun positions were pinning their infantry down with overlapping fields of fire. The Americans had prepared the battlefield properly, and by noon the German advance had completely stalled at 3,000 yards. This was not the rapid breakthrough that Kasserine Pass had led the German commanders to expect, and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken command after Rommel's departure, began receiving reports that the attack was failing to achieve any of its primary objectives. American resistance was organized, aggressive, and highly effective, with German casualties mounting rapidly without any corresponding collapse of the American line. Von Arnim studied the tactical reports with growing concern, realizing that something fundamental had changed in the American way of war. While the American Shermans were still technically outgunned by the German armor, and the terrain remained largely the same, the Americans were now fighting with a level of coordination and aggression that the Germans had not anticipated. Infantry units were no longer waiting to be overrun. They were launching immediate counterattacks that disrupted the German momentum and forced the panzers to halt their advance. This was not the demoralized force that had been shattered only 3 weeks earlier, and by March 24th, von Arnim was forced to recommend calling off the entire offensive. German casualties were significant, and it had become clear that the Americans were too strong in their current positions to be dislodged without a massive infusion of reinforcements that the Axis simply did not have. The attack was suspended, and the German forces were ordered to withdraw, marking a stunning reversal of fortune in the North African theater. German intelligence worked feverishly to understand what had caused this total transformation, interviewing captured American soldiers and studying documents recovered from the battlefield. They searched for evidence of new equipment or significant reinforcements, But they found that the Americans were using the same tanks and the same guns they had used at Kasserine. The change had occurred in just 21 days, driven entirely by Patton's radical reorganization of the Second Corps command and doctrine. Patton's method was a simple but radical leadership purge, where he fired every officer who showed even a hint of hesitation and promoted men who demonstrated an instinctive desire to attack. He ensured that command positions went to officers who understood that speed and aggression were the only ways to win battles against the Wehrmacht. Secondly, he initiated a doctrine revolution, teaching every unit to counterattack immediately when they were struck, rather than waiting for orders that might never arrive. The American defense now meant aggressive patrolling and spoiling attacks, ensuring that the Germans never had the opportunity to build up their momentum. Patton had successfully convinced his soldiers that they were superior to their enemy, not through empty speeches, but through a rigorous training regimen that rewarded aggression and punished caution. The entire Corps had learned one definitive lesson: that the attack succeeds and that hesitation leads only to failure. The Germans analyzed what El Guettar revealed about the new American capabilities, realizing that the Americans had adopted a doctrine that effectively neutralized the traditional German tactical advantages. While German doctrine relied on concentrated armor to break through weak points, the American doctrine now responded with mobile anti-tank weapons positioned to create deadly crossfires. What the Germans had expected to be a victory had suddenly turned into a desperate fight for survival against a coordinated machine that had finally found its rhythm. The Americans were no longer trying to match the Germans tank for tank in technical superiority. They were making those technical advantages irrelevant through superior coordination and overwhelming industrial firepower. Before he had left Tunisia, Rommel had written revised assessments warning that the Americans had learned faster than any opponent Germany had ever faced. He warned that they had identified every weakness demonstrated at Kasserine and fixed them in less than a month, meaning that any future offensive would require significantly more resources than Germany could afford to spare. On March 6, 1943, the very day Patton assumed command of the Second Corps, Rommel had launched his final offensive at Medellin against the British Eighth Army, which ended in a one-day disaster. 3 days later, the Desert Fox flew back to Germany on sick leave, suffering from jaundice and exhaustion, and he would never return to the African continent. By May 13, 1943, the remaining German forces in Tunisia were forced to surrender, resulting in over 250,000 Axis prisoners. The Americans had gone from the deep humiliation of Kasserine Pass to a total victory in Tunisia in less than 3 months, a transformation that shocked the German military establishment. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in July, the German defenders reported that American tactical aggression, combined with their superior logistics, made defensive operations almost impossible. By June 1944, as Rommel commanded the defense of France, his view of the Americans had shifted from mockery to a profound and fearful respect. He now wrote that the Americans were more advanced in their tactical thinking than even the British, combining material superiority with an aggressive mindset that made static defense completely ineffective. Even on D-Day, when the Americans faced heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, they continued to push inland with an aggression that Rommel had predicted. After the war, German generals like Hasso von Manteuffel and Albert Kasserine testified that the Americans had learned faster than any army in history, evolving at a speed that felt fundamentally unfair to those who had spent years mastering the craft of war. The same army that had been shattered at Kasserine Pass had become one of the most effective fighting forces the world had ever seen, proving that leadership and doctrine mattered more than years of experience. The 90 days between the shame of Kasserine and triumph in Tunisia changed the course of the century, marking the exact moment the arsenal of democracy finally found its sword. The German generals stopped underestimating the American soldier because they realized that the man across the foxhole was no longer a tourist, but the architect of their inevitable and total defeat. Do you believe George S. Patton was the only American general capable of turning the Second Corps around so quickly? Or was the American transformation in El Guettar an inevitable result of the industrial might of the United States finally reaching the front lines? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.